Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and unless I've been tardy, which is likely, this video will be released the same day as orders for the Gaunt's Ghost Command Squad open, which look to be really cool models and I will get hold of at some point for review and painting. However, this set is just a command squad of the 6 character models, so what if you want to make a whole army of Tanith? There are many Imperial Guard model options that might look close, but there's one specific feature that is obviously required for the ghosts, and that is the Camellia line cloak. My recent video series should hopefully stand as a community resource of all of the many different ways to make the cloaks, but no matter which style you prefer, you will almost certainly have to do at least some sculpting work at some point. So, in this video, I will be showing a tutorial for my method of sculpting the Tanith cloak from milliput. As this is a tutorial, I will begin with the required equipment. Firstly, a model. Somewhat obvious, but here I will be using a multi-part Cadian trooper. This would also work with the easy build Cadians, or the Catachans, or any model, or you shock horror, even a not Games Workshop model. Secondly, modelling clay. I will be using 2-part milliput, which I have been practicing with. There are other options such as green stuff and air drying clays. I would recommend against oven cure clays unless you have some way of separating the plastic model underneath, which would melt. Gloves are a good idea. Many people don't use them, but epoxy putties are mildly toxic and gloves just make everything easier to clean up. A sheet or mat under your workspace is also a good idea to keep things clean. Next, you will want some form of sculpting tool. Your fingers are sculpting tools, plastic rods or bits of sprue, metal handles of kitchen utensils. Don't use them on food after using them on epoxy, but today I'll be using these super cheap silicone shaping tools. Given that milliput is £5 for a pack and these tools are £3.50, I don't think that's unreasonable. Also an essential is a pot of water. I'm using my paint water, but a spray can lid full of water will suffice. And finally, some flat working surface that the putty won't stick to. I prefer to use this silicone mould that I made for another project, but in this video I will actually use a shredded plastic bag, just to prove that the barrier of entry is pretty low. So let's get started, and step 1, build the model. What we've all done 1,000 times. The observant amongst you may notice that I've used the beret wearing head from the Scion kit, otherwise all of these parts are just Cadian parts. Make sure you remember to include a bayonet piece, no ghost is complete without straight silver. Now we need a little bit of a plan, and no, you don't need a fine measuring tool for your model. I just did this as a skit that didn't actually make it into the video. You just need to know roughly how wide you want it to be at the shoulders, roughly how wide you want it to be at the bottom, and how long it will be between the shoulders and the bottom. Essentially, the shape that best suits is a trapezoid, a tall, skinny one. As you can just about see through the glare of the lights here, I have drawn my trapezoid onto my worksheet with just a shred of a carrier bag. I held this up to the model to make sure it's at least roughly right, but it doesn't need to be perfect, just close. Now for the milliput at last, but just before you put on the gloves there's a very important step. Put on some music, or a podcast, or something. You will have putty on your hands for some time, and you don't want to smush that into the buttons or screen of any device you might want to poke at. This type of epoxy putty is mixed in equal parts, or a 1-to-1 ratio. You will have to check the instructions of the putty that you are using. Mix the 2 parts together, a somewhat tedious but required task, and ensure that it is completely mixed and totally even throughout. After a little mixing, I like to squash the piece flat, as that makes any unmixed parts easier to see. And now that we have our milliput mixed, the timer is on. We only have a couple of hours before it starts to harden, which is plenty of time, as making one cloak takes only 10 or 20 minutes. At first, once you've done this a few times, you'll be a lot quicker. Press the putty flat into your trapezoid shape, and use your hands or tools to begin to shape it. And make sure that you keep dipping your tools into water. It is vital to keep them wet so that the putty doesn't stick to your tools, but also you don't want it too wet because you may end up with the putty not sticking to the putty when you want it to. And that's something you're just going to have to get the hang of. You can cut away edges and squish new bits into the blank cloak to adjust the overall shape to be closer to the trapezoid. Once the general shape is good, you may want to roll over the edges and press them together. When you fold this over the model, the edges can tear, so making them a little thicker will help keep it together. I also like to flatten off the edges at this point. Even though we'll damage the edges as we sculpt in a moment, it's far easier to recover them from a flat edge if there is a existing flat edge to line up with. And now for the fun step. At least, I think it's the best bit. Take your oddly shaped cloak blank and lay the narrow end on the model's shoulders. It probably won't stick all that well at first, depending on what putty you use, so you should have the ability to lift it and move it around and get it just about how you like it. You can at this point squish all of your putty back together and start from scratch, making a slightly different trapezoid shape. But I would recommend for your first couple of attempts, stick with it just for now. Get used to how the putty behaves with your tools, learn how the shapes you're created and how it might tear. Most putties have several hours of working time, so you can peel it off and smush it together and start from scratch at any point. Once you're happy, press firmly down on the shoulders to squish the putty into the surface of the plastic. Get the lower surface to grab onto all of the texture of the model so that it will stay put whilst you sculpt. I recommend getting as much surface area pressed down as makes sense for the model, including pressing it down on the back, as we can build up this area in a later step. At this point, we're only interested in the shoulders. As the putty is soft, if we press it in to make texture or folds, it will collapse if there's nothing underneath it. So we will leave the draped section for the moment. The shoulders, chest and upper back are easier to work with as there's solid plastic underneath. We can take some of the scraps that we cut off of the edges earlier and we can fill in the shoulder and the chest part of the cloak. Roll little tubes of the putty and press them into place. Again, we want to press them down quite firmly so that the details of the plastic model grab onto the milliput and hold it in place. But we also want to squish them into the other bits of milliput so that they join together as one piece. My model has very little room between the rifle and the head, somewhat poor planning on my behalf. What you can do is build the cloak with the head removed and then push the head into the milliput or glue it on later. Same goes for the lasgun, although you do want the arms and shoulders in place. As you can see, even with the care I've taken earlier, I've still torn the putty here. But that's not a big deal. As we go forwards with the model, we'll be adding detail to this. For the moment, I can patch it with another of the scraps I cut off when making the initial shape. As I mentioned earlier, this hanging section has no structure, so using one tool behind the cloak can be useful so that you have something to press into. At this point, we want to make sure that our hanging section of cloak is hanging how we want it, but only the silhouette. Ignore any individual folds or lines that you want inside the cloak and concentrate only on the outside edge. Now we have the general shape, just the silhouette, and the edges cleaned up. The middle looks terrible, but leave it alone. As much as you want to clean that up now, let's leave the milliput to cure and have a look at what we have. This is my first pass, and it looks like a fairly plain sheet over the back of the model. You could at this point call it a success and paint it, and I actually do recommend you consider this for your first few models. Most of the imperfections here will disappear if you paint a camo pattern on, and even these cracks will look just like folds. But to make it look a little nicer, let's mix up a second batch of milliput on a second day. I mentioned earlier that the drape section of cloak would collapse if we pressed into it. Well, now that our first batch of putty is cured, we can use that as a solid backing for some more details. Ultimately, this is why I sculpt in the method that I do. It takes 20 minutes on one day and 20 minutes on some other day when I get time. It's far quicker than trying to spend 4 hours in one go struggling with keeping it raised up. And it doesn't even have to be the next day. Once milliput is properly cured, it'll last forever, so come back to it the next week or the next month to do the last details and it'll still work. As if you didn't need a pile of unsculpted models next to your pile of unpainted models. Well, now we're on our second day and we have a firmer backing to our work, we can add in some folds into the cloak. Rather than literally folding the milliput, which is very hard to do evenly, simply adding stripes of additional putty over the top gives a wavy surface that a folded or fluttering cloak would have. To do this, roll a small piece of putty and lay it down on the cloak in the line that you want the fold to be. Similar to yesterday when we pressed the first piece into the shoulders, today we want to press this second piece into the first. Get both edges pressed completely flat all the way up and down so that when sculpting the fold it doesn't move around. I have seen people use a dot of superglue to hold the milliput in place, which is actually a useful tip, but I often find it's not required. If you have a piece of putty that just won't stick, maybe consider just a dot or two of superglue to hold it in place. Once the stripe is firmly down, you can pat the sides up into the shape that you want. You can make this a sharper folded edge or a rounder floating curve, however you wish to make it. You can also place these however you like, implying folds or ripples running through the fabric. I tend to prefer running them generally downwards from the shoulder to the base of the cloak, but diagonally or sideways could work for models in different poses or scenes. I also want to make a hood. In this case, I'll sculpt it folded down by making another roll of milliput, curling it and pressing it behind the model's head. Pressing it firmly around all of the edges, particularly joining it up with the folds I made on the front in the first day. Now we are nearly done. We have our largest shape, the silhouette, the mid-sized shapes in the folds and the hood. The last thing we look at is the smallest shapes, which is the surface texture that we've created while sculpting. Simply run your sculpting tools over the surface to smooth out the cracks and lumps. I find that the rounded edge of this specific tool works really well for this, but sometimes a flat edge can be preferable. Gently nurse it, poke it about, relax, and eventually you'll have it how you like it. Maybe your first attempt won't look great, but after a few tries, you'll have some good looking cloaks. I will also mention that little swear word, workflow. Just like batch painting can help save time with painting, sculpting cloaks in multiple models at a time can often make things more efficient. I tend to stick to one at a time, and if I have a little bit of leftover putty, I'll use that on the second. And you don't have to finish any part of any cloak in one go, so if you just have a tiny scrap of milliput left, stick it on the next model. It can be a fold or an edge for the next cloak, and the next time you get to sculpt, you'll have one less fold or edge to sculpt. Well, the other models don't matter for this video, so let's wait another 8 hours and look at what our sculpt looks like. It's hardly perfect, but I'm pretty happy with this, although it might be easier to see if I prime it. Probably not suitable for a competition entry or for a command unit, but there's already a command unit. I only need this for bulking up my infantry, and it is plenty good enough for that. All that remains is painting. And this video isn't about painting, and it's already run on to a quarter of an hour. You probably clicked off this video in the first 30 seconds. Well, that's what my statistics tell me anyway. If you did survive this long, do all of that, comment in the comment section, share the video with a friend, subscribe, and whatever it is all of the cool YouTube viewers like yourself talk about. I did want to have a little bit of the painting footage in the video just so you can see some paint going down, and how the imperfections in our sculpt sort of disappear into the camo pattern. It's sort of what camo pattern is for. If you're making a different type of cloak or cape or coat or something else, if it has a flat colour, then the last step, that smoothing out the surface, is where you want to spend a little extra time. As with any skill, you start off pretty poorly until you get the hang of the fundamentals, and hopefully this video will give you the right frame of mind to get into this yourself, or maybe I've scared you off. To really emphasise this, I want to show my first few models, and this is my first attempt. It is way too wide at the shoulders, has a craggy surface, torn edges, and the surface texture is because I used a toothpick as a sculpting tool. But once painted it looks just about alright, plenty fine for a mass infantry army. My second attempt is on this flame trooper, which has this hanging section. The edges are lumpy, but the surface texture is improved because I had my silicone tools here, but all these folds you can see are the cracks in the milliput because I couldn't get it to sit still. After a few attempts I had improved, and this loader is from that time. The folds and edges look pretty good, and the hood looks great. Still room for improvement. I do want to particularly mention my Hark model, which I do have a video on this coming soon, so sneaky peek. I said halfway through this video that you can stop after the first day with a smooth cloak, and that's exactly what I did with Hark. I got the edges clean and the surface smooth due to making the initial shape on the flat silicone, and I was happy enough with that I didn't need to go back to add in more folds. But this is the model I made in this video, with all my learning, practice and experiments. I hope you'll feel like joining me on this journey and that your few steps are a little smoother than mine. But that's all I really need to say about getting started with sculpting, so thank you all very much for watching. I'm ED-SKaR, and I always will be.